Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling a question that might seem kind of simple at first glance, but trust me, it gets super complex the more you think about it. We're diving into, what does it even mean to be a woman?
Right.
Like it's one of those things you think, well, duh, it's obvious. But stick with us. This deep dive is going to take us straight into the heart of feminist philosophy with some insights from both the Analytic and Continental traditions.
Should be fun.
Yeah. We're going to be exploring excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on the intersections between those two camps, Analytic and Continental feminism. Get ready to untangle some fascinating ideas around gender, identity, and the very act of trying to define an entire group of people.
It's a huge undertaking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, our source kicks off with a quote that's become pretty famous in feminist circles. It's from Simone de Beauvoir's book, The Second Sex. She says, one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. What do you think she really meant by that?
Well, I think it's a brilliant way to jump right into the heart of the issue. Beauvoir is forcing us to separate the ideas of sex and gender. She's saying that while biological sex might be determined at birth, what it means to be a woman, all the social roles and expectations and experiences, that's something we learn and internalize as we grow up.
So it's like society hands us a script labeled woman, and we learn to perform it.
That's a great way to put it. And this performance, it isn't necessarily conscious, right? It's about how we're socialized, the messages we receive, the expectations that are placed upon us because of our perceived gender.
Mm.
We become women through that complex interaction with our social environment. It's not simple.
Okay, so it's more nuanced than just saying gender is a social construct.
Yeah.
Right. It's acknowledging the power of that construct to actually shape our very understanding of ourselves, like who we think we are.
Exactly. And this is where things get even more interesting when we bring in the concept of intersectionality. Think about it this way. Can we really talk about women as a single homogenous group?
Well, our source definitely pushes back against that idea.
Yeah.
It highlights the work of Kimberly Crenshaw and others who argue that we can't ignore the ways that different aspects of our identities, intersect and influence our experiences.
Absolutely. Factors like race, class, sexual orientation, ability, all of these things intersect with gender, right? To assume that all women share the same experiences just because they identify as women ignores those very real and important differences.
So the experiences of, say, a Black working-class lesbian are going to be vastly different from those of a white upper-class heterosexual woman, though both are women.
Precisely. And that's why intersectionality is so crucial to this whole discussion.
Yeah.
It forces us to acknowledge those differences and understand how they shape our understanding of womanhood. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
It's like trying to paint a picture of the world using only one color. You're going to miss so much of the complexity and the beauty.
Exactly. And that's what we're trying to do here, right? Paint a more complete and nuanced picture of what it means to be a woman. And that's where philosophy comes in. Our source delves into two main camps that have grappled with this question: analytic feminism and continental feminism. Two very different approaches.
Okay, so let's start with the analytic side. What are some of the key approaches they've taken to defining woman? How do they tackle this?
Well, analytic feminism, with its emphasis on logic and clear definitions, has produced some fascinating arguments. One prominent example is Sally Haslanger's concept of an ameliorative definition of woman. That's a mouthful, I know.
Ameliorative. That sounds interesting. What does that even mean?
Essentially, Haslanger argues that we should define categories like woman in a way that helps us achieve greater social justice. So instead of searching for some inherent essence of womanhood, we should focus on the shared experiences of oppression that women face, what brings them together in a social and political context.
So instead of looking for what makes someone a woman biologically, we should focus on the systematic disadvantages they might face in society.
Right. And by defining woman in this way, Haslanger argues that we can better understand and challenge those systems of oppression.
That makes sense. But our source also points out that there are some critiques of this approach, right? Like, not everyone agrees with Haslanger.
Of course. No philosophical theory is without its critics. One of the main criticisms of Haslanger's definition is that it potentially excludes trans women. And that's a big problem.
Yeah, that's a really important point. And the source highlights Katherine Jenkins' work. which argues for a more inclusive understanding that centers the lived experiences of trans women.
Exactly. Jenkins points out that focusing solely on oppression as a defining characteristic of womanhood can be problematic. Trans women, for example, might experience different forms of discrimination than cisgender women, and some might not face certain forms of oppression at all. So how do we account for those differences while still recognizing the shared struggles that women face as a group? It's a tricky balance.
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one that philosophers are still actively grappling with. But it's a crucial question to ask because it forces us to think critically about how we define and categorize people and the real-world consequences of those definitions, like how those categories impact people's lives.
This is getting complex. Okay, so
Okay.
we've got analytic feminism, wrestling with definitions and inclusion. Now let's step into the world of continental feminism. I'm already feeling a bit mind-bent. What are we in for?
Hold on to your hats because things are about to get abstract. Continental feminism, with thinkers like Judith Butler, challenges the very stability of categories like man and woman. It's a whole different way of looking at things.
Oh, this is where that gender as a performance idea comes in, right? Can you break
Yeah.
that down for us a bit further? Like, what does that actually mean? Think of it this way. Instead of gender being something we are, it's something we do. It's a series of actions, behaviors, and expressions that we perform based on societal expectations. It's about how we move through the world.
So it's not about denying our internal sense of gender identity, right? But rather questioning the ways that society forces us to express that identity within very narrow and rigid categories, like the boxes we're expected to fit into.
Exactly. And Butler argues that these categories are not natural or inherent, right? But rather constructed and maintained through our repeated performances of these roles.
Yeah.
Like every time we conform, we're reinforcing those categories.
So every time we conform to those expectations, we're reinforcing the power of those categories. It's a cycle.
Precisely. And that's why continental feminists like Butler push us to question those categories and to challenge the very idea of a fixed and stable definition of woman. They're asking, like, what if those definitions are actually harmful?
Wow, this is a lot to process. And it sounds like there are some pretty intense debates within continental feminism itself about how to approach these issues.
Right.
Like, not everyone agrees on the best way forward.
You're absolutely right. There's a lot more to unpack here, especially around the concepts of freedom and domination. Like, how much agency do we really have when it comes to gender? It's a big question.
Well, I'm all ears. Let's dive into those debates next.
Okay, so we've just dipped our toes into the deep end of continental feminism. And it sounds like there's a lot of debate even within that school of thought. Like, different thinkers have different ideas about how to approach these questions about gender.
Absolutely. One of the most fascinating discussions centers around the concepts of freedom and domination.
Yeah.
How much agency do we really have when it comes to gender? Are we trapped by these categories or can we somehow transcend them? It's a big question.
It is a big question. And our source mentions thinkers like Judith Butler and Michel Foucault, who seem to suggest that language and power structures can be incredibly constraining. Like, we're not as free as we might think we are. Right. Thinkers like Butler and Foucault highlight the power of discourse, the way that language shapes our understanding of the world and ourselves. They argue that these predefined categories like man and woman, they're not neutral. They're embedded within systems of power that limit our possibilities and constrain our freedom. They're not just words.
So it's like we're born into these categories and then we're constantly bombarded with messages about how to behave within them.
Right.
We're essentially disciplined
Yeah.
into performing our gender correctly. It's like we're always being watched and judged.
That's a very Foucauldian way of putting it. And this discipline, it isn't always overt or intentional, right? It can be subtle, operating through social norms and expectations and even our own internalized beliefs about who we should be. It's like we internalize those power structures and they become part of us.
So even when we think we're making free choices about how we express our gender, those choices are still being influenced by these like invisible power structures. It's kind of unsettling when you think about it.
It can be, but this doesn't mean we're completely powerless. Our source also brings in other continental feminists like Nancy Fraser and Sayla Benhabib who offer a slightly different perspective. They don't see it as all doom and gloom.
Right. The source mentions that they believe in our capacity for reflection and accountability. So it's not all like we're just robots programmed by the system. We have some say in the matter.
Exactly. While Fraser and Ben Habib acknowledge the influence of these power structures, they also emphasize our ability to critically examine them and even challenge them. We have the capacity to reflect on the social norms that shape us, to question them, and to imagine alternative ways of being.
So it's a balancing act, right? Acknowledging the very real power of these structures while also believing in our own agency to push back against them. It's not one or the other.
Precisely. It's a complex and nuanced conversation, and there's no easy answer. But it's an important one to have because it forces us to think critically about the relationship between individual freedom and societal constraints, you know? Like, how much freedom do we really have within these systems?
Right, now speaking of pushing back against constraints, our source also mentions a different approach altogether. Martha Nussbaum's capabilities approach. It seems like she's coming at this from a whole other angle.
Nussbaum is fascinating because she tries to bridge the gap between abstract philosophical theory and practical solutions for social justice. She argues that instead of getting lost in debates about the nature of gender itself, we should focus on what women are actually capable of doing and being in a society. Like, what opportunities do they have? What resources are available to them?
So she's saying let's shift our focus from definitions to real-world opportunities and outcomes. Let's look at what women can actually achieve given the right conditions.
Exactly. Nussbaum proposes a list of essential capabilities that all individuals, regardless of gender, should have access to in order to live a flourishing life. This includes things like bodily integrity, education, political participation, and economic opportunities. It's about creating a world where everyone has the tools they need to thrive.
It's like a checklist for a just and equitable society.
Mhm.
I'm curious, though, is the argument here that all women are equally capable of doing and being all these things? Or is it more nuanced than that?
It's not about assuming that all women have the same capabilities, right? But rather about ensuring that everyone has the same opportunities to develop their capabilities to the fullest. It's about leveling the playing field, so to speak, and creating a world where everyone has the freedom to choose who they want to be and what they want to achieve without being limited by their gender.
That sounds great in theory. But I imagine there are some challenges in putting that into practice. Like, how do we actually ensure that everyone has equal opportunities?
Of course. The source points out that Nussbaum's list has been criticized for potentially reflecting a Western-centric viewpoint. Some argue that her list of capabilities might not resonate with the experiences and values of women from diverse cultural backgrounds. It's a valid critique.
So there's a risk of, like, imposing one's own cultural values on others, even when trying to promote equality and empowerment.
Yeah.
That's something to be mindful of.
Absolutely. It highlights the importance of constantly engaging in dialogue across cultures and perspectives, right? To ensure that our efforts at promoting justice are truly inclusive and equitable, we have to be careful not to assume that one size fits all.
It seems like every answer we uncover just leads to more questions. It's like peeling back the layers of an onion, and there's always another layer underneath.
That's the beauty of philosophy, isn't it? It's a continuous process of questioning and exploring, never settling for easy answers. It's about embracing the complexity.
Well, on that note, our source takes us into another complex and fascinating concept, epistemic injustice. It sounds like this is about how power dynamics influence who we believe, whose knowledge is valued, and who gets silenced. Like, whose voices get heard and whose voices get ignored.
This is a crucial area of contemporary philosophy, absolutely. It looks at how those power imbalances distort our understanding of the world and how they can perpetuate injustice and inequality.
And how does this connect to the question of defining woman? Like, how does epistemic injustice play out in the lives of women?
Well, throughout history, women's voices have been marginalized, right? And their knowledge dismissed simply because of their gender. Epistemic injustice shines a light on those power imbalances and how they can have real and lasting effects.
The source cites Miranda Fricker's work, which breaks down epistemic injustice into two main types, testimonial and hermeneutical. Can you explain those for us? Like, what do those terms actually mean?
Sure. Testimonial injustice occurs when someone's credibility is unfairly diminished due to prejudices about their social identity. In the context of gender, this could look like a woman's testimony being doubted or dismissed simply because she's a woman. Her words are taken less seriously than a man's words would be, just because of her gender.
It's like that classic scene in the film Gaslight where the husband is manipulating his wife into questioning her own sanity, right? Her experiences are invalidated because she's perceived as hysterical or emotional. Like, her feelings are seen as less valid than his.
That's a perfect example. Testimonial injustice can have devastating consequences because it can make women doubt their own perceptions and experiences. It can make them feel like their voices don't matter.
And what about hermeneutical injustice? That sounds even more complicated. Like it's not just about being disbelieved. It's about something else.
Hermeneutical injustice goes a step further. It describes the situation where someone lacks the shared concepts or language to even articulate their experiences. Imagine being in a situation that you know is wrong, but you don't have the words to describe it or to explain why it's harmful. It's like you can feel it, but you can't quite put it into words.
The source gives the example of women experiencing sexual harassment before the term even existed. They knew it was wrong, but they didn't have the vocabulary to name it, let alone fight against it. It was like this unspoken thing that they couldn't really talk about.
Exactly. Hermeneutical injustice can be incredibly isolating and disempowering because it makes certain experiences invisible. Without the right concepts and language, those experiences can't be shared, understood, or challenged. There's like this unspoken suffering.
This is all so important, but I'm curious how continental philosophers approach these issues. Do they have a different take on epistemic injustice? Like, do they see it differently than analytic philosophers do?
Hmm.
So we've been talking about how epistemic injustice can, like, silence women and invalidate their experiences. But I'm curious how continental philosophers approach these same issues. Do they have a different take on it? Like, do they see it differently than analytic philosophers do?
Yeah, there's definitely a shift in focus. While analytic philosophers like Miranda Fricker tend to focus on individual acts of injustice, continental thinkers take a broader view. They're looking at how systems of knowledge themselves can be inherently biased. Like it's not just about individual bad actors, it's about the system itself.
So instead of focusing on, like, individual biases,
Yeah.
they're looking at how knowledge is produced and who gets to decide what counts as truth. Like, who has the authority to say what's real and what's not?
Exactly. Thinkers like Michel Foucault argue that what we consider knowledge is never neutral. It's always shaped by power relations. And those power relations often benefit certain groups while marginalizing others. So, like, whose voices get heard, whose experiences are considered valid, those are questions of power.
So the very tools we use to understand the world could be biased against certain perspectives. It's like we're looking through a distorted lens and we don't even realize it.
That's the idea. Foucault used the term power knowledge to describe this intertwined relationship, right? He argued that power produces knowledge, and knowledge, in turn, reinforces those power structures. It's a cycle. It's a bit mind-bending when you really start to think about it.
It is mind-bending. Can you give us an example of how this plays out in relation to gender? Like, how has this power-knowledge dynamic shaped our understanding of women?
Well, think about the history of science and medicine. For centuries, women's bodies were viewed through a male lens, often seen as inherently flawed or inferior. Like there was something wrong with them. This wasn't just a matter of individual bias, right? But rather a reflection of a broader system of knowledge that privileged male perspectives and experiences. Women's voices were largely excluded from those fields, so their experiences weren't considered relevant or important.
So those biases were baked into the very foundation of scientific inquiry. Like, they were built into the system from the ground up.
Precisely. And these biases had real-world consequences for women, impacting everything from medical treatment to their social and political status. Like, if women's bodies are seen as inherently flawed, then that justifies treating them differently. It justifies denying them certain rights and opportunities.
It's like those biases created a distorted lens through which women were seen and understood. And that distortion had real material effects on their lives.
Absolutely. And this distortion wasn't limited to science and medicine, right? It permeated all aspects of society, from law and politics to art and literature. The way we think about gender, the way we represent gender, it's all influenced by these power dynamics.
Our source also mentions Jürgen Habermas and his concept of communicative rationality. How does that fit into this discussion? Like, what was Habermas trying to get at?
Habermas was concerned with how power imbalances can distort communication and prevent genuine understanding. He argued that for true dialogue to occur, we need certain conditions in place, like a willingness to listen to different perspectives and to reach consensus based on reason and evidence, not coercion. It's about creating a space for open and honest communication, where everyone feels like their voice can be heard.
So it's not enough to just have different voices at the table. We need to create a space where those voices can be heard and taken seriously, where everyone feels like they can speak freely and openly without fear of being dismissed or silenced.
Exactly, and that requires a commitment to equality and respect, right? Recognizing that everyone's perspective has value, even if we don't agree with it. It's about creating a space where genuine dialogue can occur, where we can learn from each other and challenge our own assumptions.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation.
Mm,
We've gone from Simone de Beauvoir's groundbreaking work on sex and gender to the complexities of intersectionality and epistemic injustice. We've explored the nuances of analytic and continental feminism and the challenges of defining woman in a way that is both inclusive and meaningful. It's been a
yeah.
lot to take in.
It has. But it's so important to engage with these ideas,
Right.
because they have real implications for how we understand the world and how we treat each other.
Absolutely. What stands out to you the most from all of this? What's the one thing you hope our listener takes away from this deep dive? If they could only remember one thing, what would it be?
I think the most important takeaway is that questioning seemingly simple concepts, like woman, can reveal hidden complexities and power dynamics. Like, we often take these categories for granted, but they're not as straightforward as they might seem. The way we define and categorize people has real consequences for their lives and opportunities.
It's a reminder that language is never neutral, right? It's always embedded within systems of power. And we need to be aware of how those systems shape our understanding of the world and how they can perpetuate injustice.
And beyond awareness, we need to be actively challenging those systems, right? Pushing for greater equality and justice in all aspects of life. It's not enough to just talk about these issues. We need to be actively working to change them.
It's a call to action, really, a reminder that philosophy isn't just about abstract ideas. It's
Uh-huh.
about understanding and engaging with the world around us and working towards a more just and equitable future. It's about making a difference.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And on that note, we'll leave our listeners with this thought. If, as some philosophers suggest, gender is indeed a performance, what role do you play in creating and challenging those performances? It's something to ponder as you navigate the complexities of your own world. Like, how are you contributing to these systems, and how can you challenge them?
Lots to think about.
That's all for today's deep dive. We hope you found it enlightening, challenging, and maybe even a little bit mind-bending. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.